I'm going to be talking about the CDACI study that actually House participated in when it first started. So I think you'll enjoy hearing some of the results. I don't know if you've been hearing them at COSM and AAO, but I'm going to sort of give you a smattering of some of the results coming out of it. Let's see. There we go. So I thought I'd give a little brief history of cochlear implants. Some of you in here lived it. Some of you, this will be new. And it'll, not very long. And then I'm going to talk in a few slides about what it was like to be born deaf before there were cochlear implants. And you can see how far we've come with this technology. And then I thought I would present the CDACI study. So, as you know, the first recorded incidence of electrical stimulation of hearing was actually in 1790. This was published in 1800 when Alessandro Volta did some experimentation on himself, and he stuck 2 metal probes in his ears and applied electrical current and reported hearing this sensation of viscous boiling fluid in his ears. And they sort of experimented. There was other people experimenting in the 1800s called, I think, electroaudiatrics or something like that, and the field died down. But really, modern day cochlear implants started in 1957 when DiGiorno and Ayers implanted this interesting looking device in the ear of a patient. And the patient over time was able to hear and be able to discriminate between some sounds, but the device broke, and I'm not sure how long they went on. A really nice summary of their work is in a paper by Mark Eisen that came out in 2003. But why this is so interesting is this experiment showed up in a paper in Los Angeles, one of the newspapers, and a patient brought the article to William House saying, look what they're doing in France. And of course, some of you knew Dr. Bill very well, and this would, of course, intrigued him. And so this was sort of the catalyst that started his work in cochlear implants. But during those times, Dr. Bill was one of the first. There were other people, too, becoming interested in the field, such as Blair Simmons and doctors at UC San Francisco, our own Dr. Brackman in Utah, and but it was very controversial, and so I'm sort of used Dr. Howard House and William House's father's quote that he used to tell them, if you're not up on it, you're down on it, and that's what Dr. Bill House's career was sort of like, is he got blasted a lot if trying to be an innovator and develop new techniques. So there were, during the time, the crux of the opposition was between the scientists and the clinicians. And the scientists felt the emphasis should have been on basic science with animals. And they also felt that, and then the clinicians felt the emphasis of clinical research should be with humans. Although, both work was going on at the same time. And the scientists felt that cochlear implant performance should be evaluated in the context of normal hearing. So if you have very modest results, incremental results, why bother? It's not worth it. Whereas the clinicians evaluated performance in the context of deafness with the philosophy that anything is better than nothing, and even a little, detection, awareness of environmental sounds would be beneficial. And this was one of the nicer comments made during the time by Harold Shuknit. Not that he had bad comments, but there were others who had really nasty comments. I have the utmost admiration for the courage of those surgeons who have implanted humans, and I admit that we need a new operation in otology, but I'm afraid that this is not it. That he was embarrassed after having said that. But the clinicians persisted, And as William House said, we have reached a stage in the development of implants in which observation or research on a large population is required for a substantive answer to the fundamental question, do cochlear implants make a significant difference to individuals with profound sensory hearing loss? And 1976 actually is the year that I started working at House Ear Institute. Had a different name at that time. Honestly, it was the Walt Disney Hearing Rehabilitation Research Center because it was funded by Lillian Disney. And then these are just some pictures of the early experiences in Los Angeles. The picture on the upper left is a device that was hand-built at House and was one of the earliest devices we worked with. And you could see our early team in around 1979. Do you recognize some of those people besides me with the yellow circle around my head? Anybody recognize anyone?
Is that Laurie Johnson?
There's Karen Berliner.
Yep.
First on the left, and Maggie Keenemeyer second on the right.
Yeah. You didn't know Norma Norton, right? Norma Norton was actually the one Dr. Bill hired, and then she hired me.
Julie Gonzalez.
And Julie Gonzalez, yeah, exactly. Oh, I was just going to show that this was Dr. Bill and Jack Urban working with Chuck Gracer in the very early days. So I bring up the Pittsburgh study because this was sort of instrumental to moving forward. The National Institutes of Health decided to have a contract, a request for proposals to do an independent study on cochlear implants. And the rumor is that the team that got it, which was Pittsburgh with F. Owen Simmons and Robert Bilger, were basically told, we want you to shut this down. So, but they actually found pretty positive results. And they found that also, and the study involved 11 patients with single channel from Los Angeles and 2 patients with single channel from San Francisco. And they were flown to Pittsburgh and spent a week going through a whole battery of tests. And the results were pretty positive that even though they could not understand speech, they detected sound across frequencies, could identify environmental sound, speech read, monitor the voice, and their quality of life was improved. They had difficulty hearing in noise, and they had some balance problems. So really, because this study, an independent study, showed results were positive in helping patients, I think that really paved the way to expand in this area. So I'm going to sort of segue now to what it was like to be born deaf in the time before cochlear implants. And does anybody recognize that man in the picture?
Kennedy.
Very young Senator John F. Kennedy in Massachusetts, where he was visiting children at the Clark School for the Deaf, which is, I believe, the oldest oral deaf school in the United States. And just to preface it, that children who are born with severe profound hearing loss, they were identified at older ages than we typically see today. It may have been at 1 year, 2 years of old. Children with more residual hearing may have been identified at 3 or 4 or 5. And today we're very fortunate to have infant screening, newborn screening in the hospitals. And then children who were born deaf often attended specialized schools. Mostly they were signers, but if they had any residual hearing, they had the opportunity to develop some spoken language. Amplification may or may not have been used. In those days, they were the big boxes that you wore for hearing aids. And auditory training may or may not have been instituted. And I wanted to show something from the Clark School because a classic study was conducted at that school and published in 1984 by Arthur Boothroyd, who showed the different levels of, by degree of hearing loss, what access to speech cues patients would have. And this was conducted on deaf oral speaking teenagers at the Clark School in Massachusetts. And as you can see on the left, as you go down in degree of hearing loss, that there's less and less access to the different speech cues. If you look at the bottom, they're sort of ordered in order of difficulty. The easiest is all the way to the right vowel height, and the most difficult is consonant place. And those lower acoustic cues tend to be more reliant on time intensity acoustic information, whereas on the right, they were much more reliant on spectral or pitch information. And it's the spectral pitch information that is particularly important for understanding speech. So if you can see, if you go down, by the time you get to 80 to 90, which is, from moderate to severe hearing loss, you are getting quite a bit of access to speech with some amplification. And this wasn't with hearing aids, this was just under an audiometer. But once you entered the realm of profound hearing loss, 90 dB and poorer, you had less and less access to speech. The amazing thing is there was access to speech, and even some of my colleagues today in research think that children who are born with severe to profound hearing loss are completely deaf and deprived of sound until they get a cochlear implant. Well, we see this isn't true, and we knew this fairly early on, that there was access to speech. It just didn't give you very much access and didn't really contribute to speech understanding, especially at the very lower levels. In terms of speech production, articulation would be delayed or absent, and that these would be mainly for individuals trained in oral communication, and intelligibility was related to degree of hearing loss, but most individuals born deaf were unintelligible with a mean rating of 19%. What that means is that if a naive listener was listening to a deaf individual speaking, they'd probably understand just under 20% of what they were saying. And then, most of you probably have heard deaf speech, the quality of breathiness, wide pitch excursions, and abnormal nasalization. And then finally, what could you develop spoken language? It would be mainly based on amount of residual hearing. It was typically learned through face-to-face communication rather than through incidental learning, and it would be delayed or disordered throughout the lifespan. So then, childhood deafness after cochlear implantation. And what I think is important to notice is cochlear implantation in children, which started in 1980 when Bill House did the first implant on a child, that this wasn't created in a vacuum. It was sort of a period of time where there were three major innovations. One was the early identification and intervention. Second were cochlear implants, and give credit to digital hearing aids. And then also the public laws for educating children in the least restrictive environment were all coming out. This was all coming out around the same time. And then our first investigation of cochlear implants in children with the single channel, and the first child was implanted at House in 1980, as I mentioned. And you can see from the picture on the right that this was the House 3M device that was manufactured by 3M in Minnesota. And this was the first cochlear implant to receive FDA approval in adults. But what we found from our FDA trials with single-channel implants in children is that most children demonstrated closed-set speech perception. There were incremental improvements in speech and language, and there was reduced distractibility manifested as improved attention span. And very soon, the multi-channel implant was started to undergo clinical trials. And the very first team was implanted at NYU in 1986. And their clinical trials followed with results indicating improved auditory performance, specifically open-set speech recognition compared to single channels. And I have to say that it's not that the single channel didn't yield open-set speech recognition, but it was in a far smaller group of children and tended to be those children in strong auditory training programs. But many more children with multi-channel implants were getting open-set speech recognition and at a faster rate of acquisition. And the FDA approval for multi-channel implants in children The first one was 1990 with the nucleus device, 97 advanced bionics, and 2001 Maternal. And today, as we all know in this room, multi-channel implants have become the standard of care for children with severe to profound hearing loss. Now, these studies were all sponsored by the device manufacturers. That's how an FDA clinical trial happens, is that the manufacturer sponsors it, collects the data, prepares a report, and submits it to the ENT advisory panel for evaluation. At the same time, there were some independent NIH investigations going on for children with CIs, and these were funded by the National Institutes of Health. And I'd like to categorize it by evolving control groups to see how this progression occurred. So at the very beginning, children with only profound hearing loss were being implanted, and the NIH-funded research was going on at the Central Institute of the Deaf. Actually, I think that's Central Institute for the Deaf. Might have to change that. And Indiana University. And they were looking at comparing cochlear implants single and multi-channel against other devices such as high-powered hearing aids and vibrotactile devices. That was CID. Indiana University was looking at the different degrees of profound hearing loss and then seeing how they compared to children with hearing aids. Because the implant data came out so much better than with the other devices, Indiana University then progressed to studying severe to moderately severe children. And that leads us to having a control group of typically hearing children in this first study, the CDACI, which is what I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about. So this study, Childhood Development After Cochlear Implantation, began in 2002, and you can see at 6 different centers around the United States, total of 188 children were enrolled, and typically hearing children, 97. And the surgery occurred between 2002 and 2004, and then the children continued to be followed. The objectives of the study were to use a whole child approach taken to investigate the effects of early access to sound with implants and childhood development, and to compare performance of children with CIs to similarly aged hearing peers on multiple developmental domains, and to identify the sources of variance that characterize potential predictors. And this is a very abbreviated demographics of the 2 samples. If you really want to read about the study design, the inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, and then the full demographics, I refer you to Nancy Fink's article, which was in Cochlear Implants International in 2007. But I just want to point out that demographically, the children between the 2 groups were similar at age and enrollment, and in gender. Ethnicity, there was a little bit of difference in Hispanic versus non-Hispanic, and you recall 3 of the centers are in the South, so between Florida, UT Dallas, Collier Center at UT Dallas, and Los Angeles, we would have large Hispanic populations. One major difference was in the socioeconomic status of the parents within the 2 groups. So we had to look at other ways of controlling those data, either statistically using standardized tests and some other mechanisms. Okay, but what is interesting is if you look at the demographics of this national study to the 2000 census, it's pretty much identical. So it is a generalizable sample. This is the study design, and you can see these were the different domains of development that we were looking at. And the study began with baseline pre-CI testing with hearing aids, cochlear implant surgery, and then post-surgical follow-up in all of those domains. And I'm going to talk primarily about language, but I'm going to present also a study from each of the other domains if we have time, and somebody will have to let me know if I'm getting close to my time window. So I'm going to discuss 2 language measures. One is the Ronell, which was the first test that was administered as the children entered the study. And then by the second cycle of the study, the second 5 years, the children transitioned to the Castle. and you could sort of see the differences in what the age was to administer the tests and the different measures that were being assessed. And our first paper I'm going to present was published in JAMA by Naparco et al. In 2010. And in this study, the children were divided into 3 groups based on age at either implantation or, for the typically hearing children, age at enrollment in the study. And this is sort of how it broke out: the youngest group, the middle enrollment group, and the later enrollment group, later age enrollment. Now I'm going to show you a lot of data, and I hope you can see it. Would it help if the lights were off or dimmed? So just to make this a little easier, just the top row is the comprehension or reception. The bottom row is expression, the production of language. And you can see it's divided by the 3 age and enrollment groups. And if we start with the farthest to the left, the age of the group under 18 months, you'll see the black lines represent the typically hearing group over the first 3 years. And then the other lines represent the language scores for the first 3 years. And these are based on raw scores. And then that hatched line at the bottom is their baseline scores as a function of age at enrollment into the study. So you can see that the mean shows, which is the middle line, shows that while there is a gap between these children and the typically hearing control group, they are far further than they would have been if they hadn't had an implant. Another thing to notice for every single one of these is the very wide variability. So you see children progressing similar to where they were without an implant versus children looking similar to the typically hearing group. When you go to the middle panel, and again, I'm just looking at comprehension, you can see that the gap widens between the children with implants during the first 3 years and the typically hearing. And it's closer to that trajectory of not receiving of unimplant at their pre-implant scores. And on the farthest right, the oldest age at implantation, you could see that there's a much wider gap, and they actually converge with those children not receiving an implant. But again, if you look at the variability, you will see from actually no progression in language all the way up to looking like typically hearing children. Okay, and just the factors that were associated with these greater rates of improvement: obviously the earlier age at implant surgery, greater pre-CI residual hearing, higher ratings of parent-child interactions or maternal sensitivity, and higher socioeconomic status. So to conclude this study, the delays in milestones typically are not overcome, and it reinforces the notion that earlier is better, and that pre-CI residual hearing boosts spoken language, gives them a head start. And despite delays, trajectories based on pre-CI baseline language demonstrate improvements with the CI in general. Now, this is a study following the kids. The last study was up to 3 years. Now we're going to 4, 5, and 6 years in a study published by Emily Tobey. And now we've moved to the Castle, where we can actually compute standard scores. So if you look and see the 100 on the left, on the vertical axis, like an IQ test, that is considered normal, standardized normal. But I've circled 85 because that's within 1 standard deviation below the mean. And so we are considering 85 to be on par with typically hearing age mates. And then you will see that, that the children have been divided into these quintiles, so it's more discrete age groups at age of implantation. And then you can see the Castle subtests. So the score is a composite score, but it's based on these subtests, a compilation of subtests. And what you will immediately, 2 things you should notice is, one, that there's very wide variability, again, for all of the different quintiles. and that the 1 quintile, Q1, for the children enrolled between 6 and 12.25 months, that they on average were scoring within the range of normal when compared to typically hearing age mates. So this somewhat confirms the JAMA paper as the children are now up to 6 years. And just to bring in some speech recognition, we looked at the relationship between language and speech at 4 to 6 years post-CI. And I'm going to give you a little description of our speech recognition hierarchy. So these are tests. It's a test battery comprised of age-appropriate measures. And to progress through the battery, the child must meet specific age and performance criteria. They have to perform so well on an easier test to progress to the more difficult test. And the advantage of this technique is it reduces floor and ceiling effects. So you're not testing a child on a test that's too easy and they're topping out, and you're not frustrating a child by testing them where they're at the floor. So this is our speech recognition hierarchy, and you can see it moves from the easiest to a little bit more difficult task, with the top of the hierarchy being open set sentence recognition. In this case, we used the hint C, hearing and noise test for children. So what we did in this next study was look at the children who had gone through all of the steps of the hierarchy, made it to the highest level by 4 to 6 years post-CI. And here you can see we have the distribution of the children through the hierarchy. On the right, you can see the easier tests, the auditory behaviors, closed set, words and sentences, open set words, open set sentences. And the 90th percentile indicates the group that went through this hierarchy at the fastest rate. And you could see if you look at the open set versus closed set line, that transition from closed to open set, the 90th percentile group made it to open set by about 1 year post-implantation. Whereas the median sample across this boundary at about 2.5 years. You'll also notice that there's a 10% group that by 5 years in this study anyway, we're still in ESP or closed set pattern perception, maybe some word perception, discrimination. But if you look at the from 4 to 5, you can see that the 90th percentile group and the median group both made it to hint. They went through the hierarchy by 4 to 5 years, and that's the group we're going to focus on. So here we're looking at the relationship between the Castle composite score versus their hint C in quiet scores for the top 50% of the cohort. And you can see that there's a strong relationship. Now, we also test children in noise. This happens to be at +5 dB signal-to-noise ratio. And while it's not as clean, there still is a relationship, even in noise. If you get to 0 signal-to-noise, forget it. And there's really no relationship. But the point, and we also found that at 48 months post-CI, sense recognition was most related to vocabulary on the Castle, whereas at 60 to 72 months, sense recognition was most related to paragraph comprehension and syntax construction. So the bottom line is the top 50% of the CI cohort reached the most difficult tasks in the speech recognition hierarchy by 4 to 6 years. They also demonstrated the linguistic structures needed for sentence comprehension. And then at 8 years post-CI, we can see the same distribution of children on the Castle test, the composite score, and see that by the 50th percent sample and above, half the sample were basically performing on par with their hearing peers by 8 years post-CI. So I'm going to now go on to a very interesting study because it came out 2 years ago and it still is highly controversial, and looking at early versus sign language exposure on spoken language results, and also on literacy and on speech intelligibility. So the question was, does early exposure to sign language promote the development of spoken language and literacy after children receive implants? A subset of 97 children were selected for this analysis, and it was based on parent report and data out to late elementary school. So children weren't cherry-picked. They just had to have all of the data points in the parent written reports to be included. And they were divided into 3 groups: no sign at baseline or post-CI activation. These children did not receive any sign language. Short-term sign group, baseline through 12 months post-CI, they had some sign language exposure, and long-term sign, baseline through 36 months post, was the long-term sign group. And you can see for this select sample from CDACI, based on the 3 groups, that they actually matched fairly closely in terms of their gender, their socioeconomic status, and their auditory demographics, their better aided ears. So you can't say, oh, the group with no sign had better residual hearing, so they were at an advantage. That actually wasn't true. Age at onset of deafness, amplification age, CI activation age. They were pretty balanced sample. And then we're going to look just at these 3 measures for the purpose of this presentation. One is, again, the Castle test. The McGarr sentences for speech intelligibility, and that was only administered when children were 6, 7, or 8 years. And then reading comprehension tests, which were measured at 5 to 7 and 9 to 11 years. And here we see, if we look at the left, the spoken language or Castle scores, and they're divided by the 3 groups. The darker blue was no sign, the lighter blue was short-term sign, and the very, very light blue was long-term sign. And they're also divided by early elementary school and late elementary school. So focusing on the left, the spoken language, you can see that that there's, again, wide variability. It's just the nature of this population. And at early elementary school, you can see that the no sign group falls just above that magic 85 standard score, indicating they're within the normative sample, normative mean. And the other 2 groups fall below. But if you look at late elementary school, that this difference is even greater for the no sign group. And what I think is most illustrative is if you look below, just below the graph, it says percent below 85 delayed. So if you can see, the percentage of children who were delayed for the no sign group was 49%, 58% for the short-term sign, and 75%. By the time of late elementary school, there's much more of an improvement. Much fewer children of the no sign group were below 85 standard score. Now we go to reading comprehension on the right. You can see for early elementary, there really is no difference between the groups. But as reading comprehension becomes more complex, you see that the groups start to break a little. And but nevertheless, reading comprehension is pretty good for all 3 groups. And then speech intelligibility, you can see, remember when I said children who were born deaf before cochlear implants tended to have an intelligibility of 19%? Well, you can see for all 3 groups with the cochlear implant, with no sign versus sign, their speech intelligibility is really quite good. In the no sign group, it's about 75%. And so the summary of comparing oral versus early sign is that over 70% of children not exposed to early sign achieved age-appropriate language scores by late elementary school, and they had a mean speech intelligibility rating of 70%, whereas 39% of children with 3 years plus sign exposure achieved age-appropriate scores with a mean speech intelligibility of 50%. Reading comprehension scores decreased for sign and non-sign groups by late elementary school. However, the non-sign group maintained scores close to age-appropriate expectations. And now I'm moving into the psychosocial domain and looking at
Laurie,
yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Going back to that, so all of those kids in that study,
Yeah.
all these kids had cochlear implants.
Yes.
So does this mean that exposure to sign actually delayed their cochlear implant?
That is the implication.
Yeah.
So this is the auditory verbal therapist push. Correct.
A.G. Bill loves this story. They love this story. On the other hand, the other group hates this story because it was always sort of inferred that language is language, and the earlier you have language input, that's going to help you whether you get a hearing aid or a cochlear implant. And this seems to somewhat refute that finding. And if you want to read the letters to the editor in pediatrics, you will see that it caused quite a controversy. And the editor wrote to us and said that one person asked that they take the paper offline. But the interesting thing is the CDACI was not designed to ask this question. It was sort of a retrospective analysis because we had an opportunity. And the reporting of sign language, we didn't test them in sign. They were tested in spoken language. But their sign categories were based on what the parents reported. So honestly, if you really want to criticize this, do a study that's prospective, that actually asks the same question, and then test it prospectively. And you can't assign children, oh, you're going to be in the sign group, you're going to be in the oral group. It's sort of unethical, and parents make this decision before we even see them. But you can go to 3 schools, one that's a total communication school or an ASL school, one that's an oral, one's an auditory verbal, and test the children in the 3 programs. And you may have a different finding.
Yeah. I mean, the data's the data.
It's very controversial, but one of the conclusions that we make is that, parents learn that they have a child who's born deaf, and they're either instructed or make the decision, I'm going to start sign language right away. But parents, it's not an easy chore for parents to learn sign language, either ASL or total communication. So they really are pigeon signers. I remember when I started here, I didn't know sign, and I was essentially a pigeon signer working with our patients. I was just a few vocabulary words ahead of them, and at some point they were farther ahead than I was in sign. So I think one of the challenges is that the parents become the model for sign language, and they're not a very good sign language model. So that's sort of how I interpret the results.
So when you wrote the paper, you have that information. As Bill said, okay, you just laid out the results.
Yep. Did
you write conclusions that made a statement that said, we feel that sign language should not be used?
No.
So let's go back to, if you had a child who was deaf, would you, the typical thought process is, get them signing early, and that's what we've always been telling them, right? Would you still do that?
I think I would have done that. I would have been a parent that learned sign language and gone online and taken the course and gone to night school and taken courses. I would have. But honestly, today children are implanted so early and they have so many opportunities. You can fit a hearing aid very soon after identification. And even if they're profound, they still have access to some auditory information, and that is still providing information up to auditory centers. So they're not completely deprived of sound. I think because if a child can be implanted very young, even under 12 months, then honestly, I don't really see the point of sign language. Maybe earlier, single channel days for sure, I would have started with sign language if I were the parent. Any other comments?
That's good.
Yeah.
Per Dr. Eisenberg.
No, you have to say per Dr. Ann Gears. She's the first author. They just tagged me on. So we're now going to talk about parent-child interactions on language, and this turns out to be an important factor. And if you read a compilation of the CDACI publications, you'll see that most of the study performance is predicted by parent-child interaction. And this is even pre-CI. Baseline parent-child interaction is highly predictive of how children may progress with their cochlear implant. So this looked at the effects of parent-child interactions on language development over a 4-year period. And the task was that the parent and the child interacted using an unstructured free play activity. And then they would do a problem-solving task, which involved completing puzzles. And they would do an art gallery task where the parent-child dyad would discuss different posters in the room. And across the 6 centers, all of our rooms looked identical. I mean, Dr. Quittner came to every center and helped set up our rooms. So we were as close as possible, collecting very similar data. And all of this was recorded. It was video recorded. The tapes were sent to Alexandra Quittner in Florida, and she and her students did the analyses. So the 3 tasks that were being investigated was maternal sensitivity, which was a coding on a scale of 1 to 7, their parent sensitivity, responsivity, respect for the child's autonomy, positive regard, hostility. They also tested on cognitive stimulation on a scale, and these scales had been developed by the NIH National Institute on child health and human development, and it was an early child care study. It's a massive study that went on around the United States. They developed these codes for maternal sensitivity and cognitive stimulation. And the cognitive stimulation were codes on how well the parent fosters his or her child's cognitive development through instruction or in the engagement activities. And then language stimulation was a scale developed by Dr. Quittner and her team in Florida. And it moves the child along a listening hierarchy, asks for behavioral or verbal responses, and links sounds with objects in the environment.
So, Laurie, sorry.
Yeah.
So all these things are studies of parents with a normal hearing kid?
No. Well, we did it with normal hearing children, yes. We did it with all the children in the study around the country. So I don't know if you remember our room. It was in the care center. And it was in the back across from it was like the speech language therapy room where they did speech language therapy. That was the room we had cameras set up, and that's where we did our recordings. Okay, so I'm just going to show you the maternal sensitivity data because it's probably the most critical to the entire study. But what you're seeing is the child coded by language age on the vertical axis and chronological age on the horizontal axis. And these are all language scores based on language age. And then the top hatched line were the hearing controls. And then the bottom one were the pre-implant scores. And then the 2 blue lines, the bolder blue line, were those children that were above the mean on their maternal sensitivity scores, and children and the language scores of children who were below the mean for maternal sensitivity. And you can see that maternal sensitivity resulted in improved language growth for children with implants. And just to sort of summarize that the maternal sensitivity and cognitive stimulation predicted increases in spoken language. What's important to note is those were all based on pre-CI, not post-CI. So even how a mother or a father interacts and communicates and works with their child very early on has an impact on their later development with cochlear implants. But that language stimulation was related to spoken language growth only in the context of high maternal sensitivity. Okay, and I'm going to do this last study because I think it's really important, and it's these types of analyses that impact society and costs of this technique, this surgical procedure to society, and it has impact in changing governing and rules on, who could be implanted, what age, more residual hearing, all of those kinds of things. So these kinds of studies turn out to be critical. So it analyzes the costs, benefits to society, and lifetime quality of life to the child. And it's based on lifetime costs of a CI. They're estimated. And this can include cost of surgery, cost of device, cost of the parent taking time off from work, cost of the evaluations in the center, all of these different costs. Then we look at the cost savings as a result of the child's educational placement. And then we look at health utility projected over a lifetime, which includes questionnaires to do with basic health and quality of life. And then the data were analyzed according to age at CI, and again, those 3 age categories that were in the first JAMA paper: implanted under 18 months, 18 to 36 months, and greater than 36 months. And again, just to reiterate, the cost utility measures were educational savings, and this was based on classroom placement across 6 years, but projected through high school. And it was referenced, it's important to note, to non-CI children with severe to profound hearing loss. The lifetime costs, again, based on the medical intervention costs. And these were based on the costs at Johns Hopkins, where this study was written up. But it was also based on the clinical models from all the other centers. And then health utility was computing a QALY. You guys know what QALY is? I know, it's sort of confusing, isn't it? So it stands for Quality Adjusted Life Years, and it's projected over a lifetime, which is, in this case, 77.5 years of life expectancy. And this was derived, the QALY was derived from the Health Utility Index via parent proxy questionnaires, HUI 2 and 3, and obtained over 6 years, and it also included health-related quality of life. So these were the numbers, and I had to compile this graph from several tables for it to make sense to me. But we're going to first look to the far left, our 3 groups age at implantation, and then we're looking at total lifetime cost and so forth. We'll start with total lifetime cost. You see that it's approximately $160,000 lifetime cost for a cochlear implant, cochlear implant. All the costs estimated. And it doesn't matter at what age you're implanted, the costs are going to be the same. And then we look at educational cost settings. And you can see that for the children who are implanted younger, their cost savings are the greatest based on where they're placed in their schoolroom placements. And the total lifetime savings with educational savings, you can see, is also higher for the early implanted children. And then the QALYs are highest for the earliest implanted group. And then the cost per QALY is less, and that's what you want. Anything under $25,000 means this is a very efficacious procedure from a society viewpoint. So how do we compute these? So let's start, we're just going to look at the under 18-month group. Compute the lifetime savings with education. So you take the educational cost savings of $191,705, which is compared to non-CI. That's your benchmark. A child who doesn't get a cochlear implant, a child who does get an implant saves society almost $200,000 by getting that implant in terms of their educational cost savings. Then you subtract the total lifetime cost of the $160,000 from the educational lifetime cost savings, the $191, and that equals a total lifetime savings with education of $31,000. So that's how that was computed. Now, if we want to see how the QALYs and cost per QALY is computed, again, we look at the top group and the total lifetime costs of $160,000, and it's divided by QALY's gain, 10.7, and your equal cost per QALY is for the earliest implant group, $14,000, just under $15,000. And you can see it's a little bit higher for the other 2 groups. Remember what I said, $25,000 means it's really good? All 3 groups are under $25,000, so that says a lot. So the societal benefits of cochlear implants in children is that based on the cost per QALY, the CI is highly cost effective for all 3 groups, and it makes the cochlear implant one of the most cost effective procedures in the United States. The early group gained a greater number of QALYs over a lifetime than the other 2 groups, indicating greater quality of life. And the cost savings is $20,000 greater than savings for older implanted children. And 81% of early implanted children are mainstreamed, resulting in cost savings of about $31,000 lifetime educational costs to society. So, wrapping this up, what we learned is that approximately 50% of the CI recipients in the CDACI study are on par with their hearing peers on measures of listening and spoken language. Predictors for success: early age at implantation, socioeconomic status, residual hearing, and maternal sensitivity. And the cochlear implant is highly cost effective to society, most notably for early implanted children. And with that, I want to list the investigative team, and I will include HEI with USC because it was at a house where we enrolled the children and started following them. Dr. Luxford was the surgeon on every one of those children. And then this was our support from the National Institutes of Health. And with that, I'll say thank you for your attention.
In looking at this information, improved cost savings, has anyone looked at as in the past the so-called state schools for the deaf across the 50 states?
Well,
if they were 100, in 1970,
right.
How many schools of deaf are there now? And in LA, we had total communication schools, sign-only schools. How many of those are still in existence now compared to all those kids that are not mainstream?
Honestly, I don't know if there's that big of a difference. I didn't put in a slide. There was one slide from this study which showed educational placement based on the 3 aged implant groups. And pre-CI, many of the children who were later implanted were in programs for institutions for the deaf. Whereas the youngest implanted children, very few of them tended to be placed in those institutions. And then there was the partially mainstream group. But what you saw across all 3 groups is movement. So if a child before they got an implant were in a school for the deaf, you saw after implantation they moved into partially mainstream and even into regular mainstreaming. So there was a lot of movement, not usually down, but usually up. So I can't answer your question about what the status is. The deaf lobbies and the deaf organizations still wield a lot of power in their local governments as well. We don't see as much controversy at conferences, not so many bomb scares as we used to see, but they still, I think they're accepting the cochlear implant, but there's still some hard feelings about it.
Or is there is Riverside, is that still?
I think Riverside is, in the school at Fremont. I think both of them are. And I think a couple of our children enrolled in CDACI at House were originally at Riverside School and became patients and then were implanted. And yet we have some children, one child who probably would have had an ABI if the ABI was available then and we had better imaging resolution, probably wouldn't have been a CI candidate, was a CI, and she never did anything with the cochlear implant. She is now in the Fremont school, just thriving. She's a signer, has a social group, culturally into the deaf, and that's the right decision for her. So, again, about 10% of this sample did not flourish with the cochlear implant, and most of them continue to sign.
Laurie, what's
Yeah.
the economic impact, aside from the educational costs that you presented, patients getting implants?
Let me go back to that. So the educational costs, lifetime costs, the savings were based on educational. The lifetime costs were based on the intervention and all the ancillary costs involved.
Yeah, they're not old enough to get folks into the workplace so that they have, because of their now hearing abilities, are able to function better in society. The kids aren't old enough. So what's the oldest kid now?
Our kids are now teenagers. Some are over 18. We tested them out to 13 years post-CI. so not age 13, but 13 years of follow-up. So these children are either close to 18 years or beyond 18 years. We're next week submitting a grant for the final phase of this study, final cycle. And if it should get funded, then we can follow them into early adulthood and look more at what impacts a young adult who was born deaf with an implant.
To be employed,
Are they in college? Do they live independently? Are they married? Do they have romantic relationships? You know, what kind of jobs do they have? Are they in college? What college? You know, those kinds of things. And I think this study could be one of the few studies that can really answer that on a national basis. And one other thing we're hoping to do if it gets funded is to expand this cost utility analysis much farther out, and also prepare the entire CDACI database for public use so people can have access.
Is there a way to measure quality of life? Because that's
We are measuring quality of life. It's sort of parent proxy, and we use some standardized measures. When the study started, really there weren't measures for deaf children and even deaf adults, but in the interim, quality of life measures are being developed, quite a few. There's the one in South Carolina with Ted McCracken. I believe House is involved with, is one of the sites for that. In CDACI, Yvette Sejas at University of Miami has developed one for children and adolescents that the child themselves fills it out, and it's specific to cochlear implants. So there's a lot of work going on in that, and we hope to continue to work on it if our grant gets funded. So the 4 aims for the grant moving forward is, one is to get this final data collection. It would be online surveys because it's hard to get these kids in, young adults in. And then we want to look at this much broader cost utility, health utility measure. We want to look at quality of life, where the children themselves fill out the form. And then we're looking at communication, acquisition, time to acquiring these skills, and looking at the effects of intervention on their development and the effects on adult now that they're adults. And then our last one is to prepare the database for public use. Let's hope we get funded. It'd be a shame not to, okay? Don't you think?
Really.
To have a national study go this far and not take it to completion. So,
would be a shame.
yeah, it would be worth it.
Laurie, I have one more question, which is logistical. On that 1984 paper that you cited, there are
Arthur Boothroyd.
thresholds that were the like over 110, like 120 and 130.
Yeah.
Do our youngers go that high anymore, or is there a idea?
He probably had a special audiometer. It was Arthur Boothroyd. He was a physicist, so maybe he developed it himself. But honestly, once you get past 120, it's likely a vibrotactile response to sound being so loud. And he even did some studies to say, how can you separate an auditory response from a vibrotactile response? And you can even see a vibrotactile response on an audiogram. It's usually what they call the corner audiogram, 250 and 500 hertz. It's just this little corner. That's probably not an auditory response. It's probably a vibrotactile response.
Okay, thank you again.